Less than 2 hours before 50% tariffs were set to hit $20 billion of Canadian goods, Donald Trump picked up his phone and posted 3 sentences that changed everything. He said he had paused the tariffs, he said the two countries had a deal, and then he added one small phrase that almost nobody caught in the moment, subject to the finalization of documents. That phrase is the entire story, because a deal that still needs to be finalized is not a deal. It is a countdown clock with a new number on it, and that number is August 21st. If you think this trade war ended on the night of August 19th, you have been misled by a headline. What actually happened was a last-second reprieve, dressed up as a resolution, with the real deadline pushed forward by exactly 72 hours. And inside those 72 hours sits an enormous amount of unfinished work, legal, political, and diplomatic, work that has to get done correctly, or this entire standoff snaps right back to where it stood at 11:58 in the evening on August 19th. Tariffs live, goods taxed, and two governments right back at the table with even less trust than before. If you're new here, hit subscribe now, because almost no one is walking through what actually has to happen in the next 2 days for this deal to survive. Let's rebuild the full picture, because the last 72 hours only make sense once you understand the 18 months that led into them. This entire confrontation traces back to February 1st, 2025, when Trump signed his first tariffs against Canada, 25% on most goods, 10% specifically on energy, framed as a response to fentanyl trafficking across the northern border. Canada hit back almost immediately, matching with retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion of American goods, a number that climbed to $155 billion within 3 weeks. That single decision to retaliate, rather than simply absorb the tariffs the way most countries eventually did, is the hinge this entire standoff swings on. Everything that followed, every escalation, every deadline, every Depression-era statute pulled off a dusty shelf, traces directly back to that first week. By late July 2025, Trump escalated again, sending a letter to newly elected Prime Minister Mark Carney threatening 35% tariffs effective August 1st, with an explicit warning that any Canadian retaliation would simply be added on top of that number. Carney refused to be rushed. Standing in front of reporters that summer, he said plainly that Canada would not accept a bad deal just to make a deadline disappear, that the goal was not an agreement at any cost, but an agreement that actually served Canadian workers. That August 1st deadline came and went without a final resolution, tariffs on non-compliant goods holding at their existing levels while negotiations dragged into the fall. Then came the moment that reshaped the entire legal foundation of this fight. In February 2026, the United States Supreme Court struck down the broad emergency tariff authority Trump had been using since day one, ruling that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act never actually gave the president unilateral authority to impose tariffs at this scale. That ruling should have slowed the tariff campaign considerably. Instead, within hours, the White House pivoted to a temporary 10% tariff under a completely different statute, while lawyers went searching for something more durable. What they found was Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a provision buried inside the same Smoot-Hawley legislation historians blame for deepening the Great Depression, a provision that had not been used to impose an actual tariff in 77 years. On July 20th, 2026, Trump signed 3 separate proclamations under that statute, each one aimed at Canada, covering motor vehicles, alcoholic beverages, and dairy, each one carrying an additional 50% duty, effective at 1 minute past midnight on August 19th, 2026. Crucially, the tariffs applied regardless of whether the underlying goods qualified for duty-free treatment under the existing USMCA trade agreement, the very protection that was supposed to shield exactly this kind of trade from exactly this kind of unilateral action. The United States Trade Representative estimated the 3 proclamations together covered close to $20 billion in Canadian goods, everything from cement and hockey sticks to furniture, wine, and clothing, buried in the fine print of the annexes. Administration officials were remarkably candid about why Canada, specifically, was being targeted this hard. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Ambassador Jameson Greer both pointed directly at the retaliation from February 2025, noting publicly that Canada and China were the only 2 economies on the planet that chose to fight back against the original tariffs rather than simply negotiate. The 50% duty was framed as a direct consequence of that decision, punishment layered with pressure, aimed at forcing Ottawa into a broader renegotiation of USMCA itself, which had just entered a state of prolonged uncertainty after Washington declined to renew it on July 1st. That non-renewal decision deserves its own moment of attention, because it is the backdrop against which everything in the final week of this standoff actually played out. USMCA's built-in review clause required the 3 countries to agree on a 16-year extension by July 1st, 2026, or trigger a rolling 10-year annual review process instead. Trump made his intentions clear months in advance. In June, sitting in the Oval Office, he told reporters he didn't know if he was going to renew the agreement at all, adding bluntly that the United States didn't need Canada's cars, didn't need Canada's lumber, didn't need Canada's energy, didn't need anything Canada had to offer. When the deadline arrived, Washington made it official, declining to renew, triggering the annual review mechanism, and leaving the entire agreement in a form of legal limbo that now stretches, at minimum, until 2036. So by the second week of August 2026, two enormous pressure points were converging on the exact same calendar date. A 50% tariff deadline built around a Depression-era statute nobody had used since 1949, and a trade agreement covering $1.3 trillion in annual cross-border commerce sitting in open-ended uncertainty, with no clear pathway back to stability. Canadian negotiators, led by Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc and Chief Negotiator Janice Charette, had been camped out in Washington for more than a week straight, meeting repeatedly with Greer and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, describing the talks in real time as delicate, intense, and at times outright nasty. Here is your first rehook, and it matters more than almost anything else in this story. Carney had made a promise, repeated publicly many times over the preceding year, that Canada would not accept a bad deal simply to make a deadline disappear. That promise was tested to its absolute limit in the final 72 hours before August 19th, because the alternative to a bad deal was not a good deal. The alternative was 50% tariffs landing at midnight, live, immediate, with no more room to negotiate once the goods started crossing the border under the new rate. And then, with less than 2 hours to go, Trump blinked, sort of. Late on the evening of August 18th, Trump posted to social media that he was pausing the 50% tariffs against Canada for a 3-day period, based, in his own words, on the fact that the two countries, subject to the finalization of documents, had a deal. He offered almost no specifics beyond that, except for one striking detail, a reference to potentially reviving the Keystone XL pipeline, the long-dead Alberta to Nebraska oil project that had been canceled back in 2021. The U.S. Trade Representative's office followed up with slightly more color, describing a deal that would include comprehensive market access for American goods, economic security commitments, digital trade alignment, and provisions designed to protect the American market and American workers. Carney's response, released roughly an hour later, was notably more careful. He confirmed the postponement, but did not use the word deal himself. His statement read that substantial progress had been made, while important work still remained, and that Canada would continue focusing on building a stronger, more independent, and more competitive economy, regardless of how the negotiations concluded. That is not the language of a leader celebrating a finished agreement. That is the language of a leader confirming a temporary reprieve, while withholding judgment on whether the underlying terms are actually acceptable. By Wednesday morning, August 19th, the gap between the two leaders' public framing had narrowed considerably, but not disappeared entirely. Trump told reporters touring construction projects on the White House grounds that the United States had, in his words, come to a deal with Canada, claiming Canadian negotiators had given Washington the points it needed on issues including market access for American agricultural products. He hinted that the final agreement could include changes to tariffs on Canadian autos, a possible reduction in steel and aluminum duties, and the long-shot revival of Keystone XL. Ambassador Greer, speaking separately, said the administration believed it had eliminated some of the long-standing irritants between the two countries. Carney, in a social media post released around midday, struck a notably more assertive tone than his statement from the night before. He wrote that Canada had entered these discussions holding the best overall trade terms of any partner Washington had negotiated with, and that the two sides were now moving toward an agreement that reinforced that Canadian advantage specifically, securing the best terms in each of Canada's most important strategic sectors while providing greater long-term certainty about the future of the trading relationship. Read those two statements side by side. Trump describing concessions Canada supposedly made, Carney describing an agreement built around protecting Canadian advantages, and you start to see exactly why the phrase subject to finalization of documents matters so much. Two leaders can agree that talks went well without agreeing on what the paper actually says, once lawyers on both sides sit down to write it. That brings us to the number in this video's title, and to why it matters more than the headline from 2 nights ago. The pause is not indefinite. Multiple outlets confirmed the suspension runs, specifically through August 21st, with the 50% tariffs set to snap back into force automatically if a finalized signed agreement is not in place by then. Some reporting described the window slightly differently, running through the end of the week, but the core mechanic is identical regardless of the exact hour. This is not a resolved trade war. This is a trade war on a 72-hour hold, waiting on paperwork that both sides have publicly acknowledged is not yet finished. So what actually still needs to happen inside that window, and why does Trump specifically still have work to do on his side of this negotiation? Start with the legal architecture underneath the entire threat. Section 338 has not been used to impose a real tariff in 77 years, and legal scholars remain genuinely divided over whether it survived being effectively superseded by newer trade statutes passed in 1962 and 1974. Trade lawyers have already filed challenges arguing the administration is stretching authority. Congress never clearly granted for this specific purpose. If a final agreement gets signed under the shadow of a legally shaky tariff threat, and that threat later gets struck down in court the same way the broader emergency powers tariffs were struck down back in February, the entire foundation of whatever gets finalized this week becomes vulnerable to challenge. That is not a small detail buried in a footnote. That is a structural risk sitting underneath the entire agreement, and resolving it, or at least accounting for it in the final text, is genuinely unfinished work on the American side. Then there is the question of what specifically goes into the final documents on trade in autos, steel, and aluminum. Trump's public comments hinted at changes to auto tariffs and a possible reduction in metal duties, but hinting is not drafting, and drafting is not signing. Any change to sector-specific tariff schedules requires coordination across multiple federal agencies, Commerce, the Trade Representative's Office, and Customs and Border Protection, all of which need updated guidance before a single shipment can actually clear the border under new terms. 2 days is an extraordinarily tight window to finalize legal text covering multiple industries, multiple tariff categories, and multiple carve-outs, especially when the underlying number for several of those categories was still being negotiated as of Wednesday afternoon. There's also the Keystone XL wrinkle, which Trump raised almost as an aside, but which carries far more complexity than a passing social media mention suggests. The pipeline was canceled in 2021 on environmental and regulatory grounds that have not simply vanished because a president mentioned reviving it in a paragraph about tariffs. Any actual revival would require new permitting, new environmental review, likely new litigation from opponents who fought the original project for over a decade, and buy-in from a private developer willing to restart construction on a project it already wrote off once. If Keystone XL genuinely sits inside the final trade agreement as a concrete commitment rather than a talking point, that alone represents months, not days, of additional regulatory work still ahead, regardless of what gets signed by Friday. Now flip to the Canadian side of the ledger, because Carney's work is not finished either, and understanding both halves of this equation is the only way to understand why the phrase real deadline actually applies to both governments, not just one. Carney has spent the better part of a year building political cover for exactly this kind of agreement, but that cover has limits. 8 of Canada's 10 provinces have kept American alcoholic beverages off government store shelves since early last year, a coordinated act of provincial retaliation that Washington has repeatedly cited as a justification for the broader tariff campaign. Any final deal that asks Canada to formally roll back those provincial measures requires buy-in from premiers who do not answer to Carney directly, who have their own political incentives, and who have shown, through Ontario Premier Doug Ford's repeated public statements, a willingness to push for harder retaliation rather than softer concessions. Getting 10 separate provincial governments aligned behind a finalized federal trade agreement inside a 72-hour window is not a formality. It is a genuine coordination problem with a real possibility of friction. There's also the deeper structural reality hanging over absolutely everything in these talks, the fact that USMCA itself remains unrenewed, sitting inside a 10-year annual review process that stretches, at the outer edge, all the way to 2036. Whatever gets finalized this week on tariffs does not resolve that underlying uncertainty. It is, at best, a truce layered on top of a much larger unresolved negotiation. Trade lawyers and analysts covering this story have made the point explicitly. Success or failure in this specific round of talks sends a signal about the prospects for the broader USMCA renegotiation still to come, but it does not substitute for that renegotiation. Even a perfectly finalized tariff agreement by Friday leaves the two countries staring down another multi-year process of hammering out what North American trade actually looks like for the next decade. Here is the number that puts all of this in perspective, and it comes from independent economic analysis rather than either government's own talking points. A calculation from Veda Partners estimated that if the 50% tariffs had actually taken effect on schedule, the average tariff rate on all Canadian exports to the United States would have risen from roughly 4.7% to 6.3%, a real but relatively contained macroeconomic shift, since the targeted goods represent only about 5% of everything the United States imports from Canada in a given year. That number matters because it tells you something important about the nature of this specific fight. This was never primarily about the raw economic damage of one narrow tariff package. It was about precedent, about leverage, about which government blinks first when a Depression-era statute gets pointed at an ally for the first time in nearly 8 decades. And precedent is exactly why the next 72 hours carry weight far beyond the $20 billion of goods directly at stake. Every other country still negotiating with Washington, across Europe, across Asia, across Latin America, is watching how this specific standoff resolves. If Canada walks away from this window, having successfully protected its most important strategic sectors, the outcome Carney described in his own public statement, that becomes a template other negotiating partners study closely. If the deal collapses and the 50% tariffs snap back into force at the end of this window, that becomes an entirely different kind of signal, proof that even 11th-hour agreements described publicly by a sitting president as a deal can still fall apart before the ink dries. There's a political dimension sitting underneath all of this, too, one that explains part of why Trump chose to blink at all, even temporarily, rather than simply letting the tariffs take effect as originally scheduled. Nearly 72% of Canada's total goods exports flow to the United States, an enormous dependency that in theory gives Washington enormous leverage. But tariffs are ultimately paid by American importers, who then pass the cost through to American consumers, and the administration is heading into November's midterm elections against a backdrop of persistent frustration over the cost of living. A fresh round of 50% duties landing on categories that touch everyday consumer goods, cement for construction, dairy for grocery shelves, alcohol for retail, carries real domestic political risk at exactly the moment Washington can least afford it. That calculus almost certainly factored into the decision to extend the deadline rather than let the tariffs bite and sort out the fallout afterward. There is a historical pattern worth pausing on here, because it explains why so many trade lawyers watching this specific standoff reacted with more skepticism than the celebratory headlines suggested was warranted. Trump has used exactly this maneuver before. The 11th hour extension dressed up as a breakthrough more than once across the past 18 months. The original July 9th reciprocal tariff deadline got pushed to August 1st. That deadline came with a promise from Commerce Secretary Lutnick that there would be no further extensions, delivered on camera, in plain language, only for the administration to keep negotiating individual country deals well past that supposedly final date anyway. A pattern like that does not mean this particular pause is destined to collapse, but it does mean treating a presidential social media post announcing a deal as equivalent to a signed, ratified, legally binding agreement has been a mistake before, more than once, in this exact trade relationship. Look closely at the specific language both leaders chose in the hours after the pause was announced, because the gap between their word choices tells you almost everything about how much work genuinely remains. Trump used the word deal repeatedly, framing the outstanding steps as a formality, paperwork catching up to an agreement everyone already understood. Carney, by contrast, never once used the word deal in his own public statements during that window. He spoke of substantial progress. He spoke of important work still to be done. He spoke of Canada building a stronger and more independent economy, regardless of how the specific negotiation concluded. That is not the language of someone confirming a finished agreement. That is the language of someone leaving himself deliberate room to walk away if the final text does not match what Ottawa believes it negotiated. This gap between rhetoric and reality is not new to this specific relationship, and it is worth understanding exactly why it keeps happening. Trump's negotiating style, documented extensively across trade talks with dozens of countries over the past year and a half, consistently front-loads public claims of victory before the underlying legal text is actually finished. It happened with the initial China truce in May 2025, later revised and extended multiple times as new disputes emerged over rare earth exports and soybean purchases. It happened with several of the reciprocal tariff frameworks announced throughout 2025, many of which required months of follow-up technical work before implementing regulations actually matched the headline terms announced at a press conference. Canada's negotiators, having watched this pattern play out repeatedly with other countries, have every reason to insist on ironclad final language before declaring anything finished. And that insistence is very likely part of exactly what is consuming the additional 72 hours right now. Consider also what is specifically still being negotiated on Canadian agricultural access, since Trump singled this out by name as one of the sticking points Canadian negotiators supposedly conceded on. Canada's dairy sector operates under a supply management system, a domestic pricing and quota structure that has been one of the single most contentious issues in North American trade talks for the better part of a decade, surviving multiple rounds of negotiation under both the original USMCA talks and every subsequent review since. If the final agreement genuinely includes expanded American access to Canadian dairy markets beyond what USMCA's existing tariff rate quotas already allow, that represents a materially significant concession, one that would need to survive scrutiny from Canada's dairy industry, from provincial governments in Quebec and Ontario, where dairy production is concentrated, and from opposition parties in Ottawa who have signaled they would treat any erosion of supply management as a major political vulnerability for Carney's government. None of that scrutiny happens instantly. All of it takes time that the current 72-hour window barely accommodates. There's also a currency and market dimension worth watching closely over these final hours, because financial markets tend to price uncertainty faster and more honestly than political statements do. The Canadian dollar had already touched some of its weakest levels in more than a year during the worst stretch of this standoff, with speculative traders piling into bets against it at a scale rarely seen for a G7 currency. Bond markets and equity analysts covering companies with heavy cross-border exposure, automakers, building materials suppliers, agricultural processors, have spent the past several days adjusting risk premiums based not on whether a deal gets announced, but on whether a deal actually gets signed, finalized, and implemented without a subsequent legal challenge unwinding it. That distinction between announced and implemented is exactly the distinction this entire 72-hour window exists to resolve. Zoom out one more level, because the timing of this specific standoff relative to the broader USMCA review process matters enormously for how much this week's outcome actually settles. Even in the best-case scenario, full signed agreement, tariffs permanently lifted, every outstanding sector issue resolved by Friday, that outcome only settles the immediate 50% tariff threat. It does not settle the underlying, much larger question sitting inside the newly triggered 10-year annual review mechanism, the process that now governs the entire future of USMCA after Washington's July 1st decision not to renew the agreement in its existing 16-year form. Analysts covering the broader review have been explicit about this distinction from the beginning, describing the current standoff as one data point inside a much longer negotiation, rather than a standalone conflict with its own clean resolution. Whatever gets finalized in the next 2 days effectively becomes an early signal for how the annual review talks unfold over the following years, not a substitute for those talks. That reality reframes the entire question of who actually still has work to do, and why the answer includes both governments rather than just one. Trump has documents to finalize covering autos, steel, aluminum, and a symbolically loaded pipeline commitment that will take considerably longer than 72 hours to become anything more than a talking point. He also has to manage the political optics of a deal that, according to independent analysis, addresses a fairly narrow slice of overall Canadian trade exposure, while avoiding a scenario where declaring victory prematurely and then watching the deal partially unravel creates its own political liability heading toward the midterms. Carney has provinces to bring fully into alignment, a dairy sector watching closely for any hint of expanded American access, and a domestic political environment where his own promise never to accept a bad deal is being tested in real time, with every additional day of delay carrying its own cost in the form of continued uncertainty for Canadian exporters who still do not know, as of this moment, what tariff schedule will actually govern their shipments starting this weekend. Every business with meaningful exposure to this specific trade corridor, automotive suppliers moving components across the border multiple times before a single vehicle is finished, building materials, companies that source cement and lumber from Canadian producers, dairy processors on both sides, watching to see whether supply management terms shift, has spent the past several days in a genuinely uncomfortable holding pattern, unable to fully plan for either outcome because neither outcome has actually been confirmed yet. That uncertainty itself carries measurable economic cost, showing up in delayed shipping decisions, cautious inventory management, and credit committees applying wider risk premiums to any transaction tied to this specific trade relationship until the actual terms are locked in writing. So where does all of this actually leave the next 2 days? Both governments have publicly signaled optimism. Trump has repeatedly used the word deal, even while acknowledging it remains subject to finalization. Carney has described substantial progress, while carefully avoiding any claim that the work is actually complete. Behind both statements sits a genuinely complicated stack of unfinished business, legal vulnerability around the underlying tariff statute, unresolved details on autos and metals, an aspirational pipeline revival that would take months to even begin moving through regulatory channels, provincial political coordination inside Canada, and the much larger, entirely unresolved question of what USMCA itself looks like for the rest of this decade. None of that guarantees collapse. Sources close to the talks on both sides have described the two countries as very close, suggesting the outstanding gaps are measured in details rather than fundamental disagreements, the kind of gap that experienced trade lawyers can often close within a matter of days rather than weeks. But very close is not finished, and the difference between those two states over the course of the next 48 to 72 hours is the difference between a genuine resolution to 18 months of escalating trade conflict and a sudden reversion to 50% tariffs, landing on $20 billion of goods with even less patience left on either side of the border than existed before this specific pause was ever announced. Watch what every other trading partner still negotiating with Washington does in the next 72 hours too, because Canada is not the only government treating this specific window as a live test case. Countries with their own pending tariff reviews, their own unresolved Section 301 investigations, their own frameworks still being finalized months after their headline announcements, are watching to see whether Ottawa's insistence on ironclad final language before declaring victory actually produces a better outcome than simply accepting the first framework offered at the negotiating table. If Canada's approach produces a durable agreement that survives legal scrutiny and holds up past the initial celebration, that becomes a template. If it instead produces a partial collapse, tariffs snapping back after documents fail to materialize on schedule, that becomes a cautionary tale about the risk of letting a president announce victory before the paperwork exists to back it up. So where does all of this actually leave the next 2 days? Both governments have every incentive to get this finished. Trump wants a durable win heading into the fall political calendar, not a repeat of the July 9th deadline that slipped, then the August 1st deadline that also slipped, then months of individual country deals negotiated piecemeal well past their supposedly final cutoffs. Carney wants an agreement he can defend at home as protecting Canada's most important strategic sectors, not a rushed concession that unravels provincial support the moment its full details become public. Both of those incentives point toward finishing the job rather than letting the clock run out. But incentives are not guarantees, and the specific mechanics still standing between now and a fully signed, legally durable agreement, sector-by-sector tariff schedules, provincial buy-in on retaliatory measures, a symbolically loaded pipeline commitment, and a dairy access question that has derailed North American trade talks before, are genuinely substantial for a window this short. That is the real story hiding underneath the headlines celebrating a last-minute deal. There was no deal on the night of August 19th. There was a pause, an extension, a bet by both governments that the remaining details could be finalized faster than a full return to open conflict. Whether that bet pays off depends entirely on what happens inside a window that is, as of this moment, already ticking down toward its final hours, with lawyers on both sides of the border racing to turn a social media announcement into something that can actually survive contact with customs officials, provincial legislatures, and whatever court eventually reviews the legal statute underneath the whole threat. Trump still has documents to finalize. Carney still has provinces to bring fully on board. And the broader question of what the entire North American trading relationship looks like for the next decade remains completely unresolved, no matter what gets signed by the time this specific clock runs out. If this breakdown helped you understand what's actually still unresolved behind the headlines, share it with someone who thinks this trade war ended 2 nights ago. Drop a comment below with whether you think the deal actually gets finalized before the new deadline hits, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens the moment this window closes.